Haruki Murakami is considered one of the most unique novelists of the 21st century. And today, we are going to be hearing from Murakami himself on the three different things that all writers must do to become original. Because you don't want to be an unoriginal writer, or you don't want to be so bland that no one will remember your style. And when you listen to certain music, like sometimes I'm listening to a Spotify playlist and hear the start of a song and I'm like, whoa, that's Pink Floyd or the Suicide Boys. I'm like, damn, they have such a memorable sound that I automatically know who it is. And the same thing could be said of writers. That's what we are trying to achieve. And with Murakami today, we're going to explore so many great things. So let's get started on the first thing that you need to do. Quote, the artist must possess a clearly unique and individual style of sound, language, or color. Moreover, that uniqueness should be immediately perceivable on first sight or hearing. And so before we get into all of this, how do you develop this unique style? How do you get to step number one? And the number one thing that you need to be doing right now that most people don't take seriously is reading good literature, consuming it. Because the number one thing I've seen across thousands of writers I've worked with or taught is that the weakest ones do not read. They may have the most unique ideas and all this different stuff, but at some point, you have to start studying the tape. You may be, the greatest athletic specimen of all time, but that's not going to cut it in the NFL anymore. You need discipline and the ability to understand where your body's at and so many other things. And that only works if it's in relation to something else. If you can contrast that with another author. If you sit down and look at your work right now and say, I'm going to compare this to Murakami. How good am I doing? Most authors are 1% of the way there. And if they were honest with themselves, they'd be like, oh my God, I need to start working harder. I need to start really figuring out how to hit the next level. And it also shows you kind of what direction you want to go, because at the start, a lot of authors are going to end up having to steal parts of their style from someone else. And that's not the end of the world, honestly. Like a lot of first-time novelists, like for instance, David Foster Wallace wrote on the back of Pynchon for his first novel, The Broom of the System. Cormac McCarthy's The Orchard Keeper was very Faulknerian. And that's not the worst thing in the world. If you want to go and join everyone in the Kindle graveyard or in the traditional publishing graveyard, go ahead. I don't know if you know this, but 98% of books that are published by a major house sell less than 5,000 copies. 98%. If you make it big and get that deal that you've dreamed of having, there's a 98% chance it will sell less than 5,000 copies, which will net you less than $10,000 in profit and more likely less than $5,000 in profit. And the easiest way to stand out, to sell book copies, is to be unique because it's the axiomatic form of branding. Every single author, I should say, that sells a ton of books has an automatic association with their writing style or the content that they write about. For instance, if you hear the name Cormac McCarthy, you probably think of No Country for Old Men or his Westerns, even though I think that his Southern literature is better than his Western literature. When you hear David Foster Wallace, you probably think these big unfinished books that are really hard, even though his nonfiction is probably better than his fiction. When you hear Murakami's name, you probably think of a weird Japanese guy that writes, magical realist stories with cats. Even though in some of his novels, like Norwegian Wood, he transcends a lot of that. And so when you read a lot and start to eventually, imitate a style, then break away from it, you give yourself that opportunity. And your style must be so unique that it can only be wholly your own. And this is really hard. And if you guys want to know Murakami's favorite books, I have assembled a free PDF, the biggest and best resource on Murakami's inspirations. And all you have to do is go down to the link in the description below and you can get it for free. And one last little secret tip, a lot of the time, this kind of instant association that we make with some of the bigger authors has to do with place. As you heard me talk about earlier, Murakami, I think of like Japan, and there's this magical feeling to it. I'm seeing images. When I think of McCarthy, I think of all his beautiful nature settings and these kind of Western landscapes. When I think of David Foster Wallace, I think of all the different unique places like the halfway houses and the tennis academies that he's written about in detail. And all these authors do care to write about settings in a very unique way, because that's where stylistically you have the most room to show off your skills, because you hopefully aren't trying to shock jock, because doing this through characters isn't really the best way to do this. If you have a bunch of characters who are crazy and do all these things, the characters may be memorable, but you won't be memorable. And when you really learn how to write about a certain place or an environment around you, and this is why these authors write about the same places time and time again. McCarthy wrote for the first 18 years of his career about the US South. Murakami, most of his novels, is writing about very similar landscapes and places in Japan. And one could say that his last novel, Killing, I don't even know how to say that name, but Murakami's last novel kind of took place outside of the cities in this mansion in the country. And a lot of people didn't like it because it was somewhat separated from his usual style. And with setting comes the vibe. That's what you are doing. When you build a world or build a setting, you're putting out this vibe. And so now that we're at the start of this journey, I want to talk to you guys about something, because as you're starting to hear, style builds upon itself and it does upgrade itself and all these other things. But as crazy as this may sound, the Beatles on Revolver or Sgt. Pepper at some level still do sound like the very early Beatles, even though they had transcended and evolved. There were still many things that they did at the start that they were doing at the end. The same could be said about Murakami. When you read Hear When Sing and Pinball, his pinball novel, there is the idea of magical realism. There is the rat, which was a continuing character in Murakami novels. There are so many different elements. He just didn't have the skill yet to work out. And every single other author when I've read through their entire bibliography, the most successful ones are like that, because they are working within a similar world. They are working within a similar style. And I think it's very egotistical as writers to think that we can do all these different styles. I think near the end, when you become a master, you can, but especially at the start of your career, when you're taking it seriously. And for most people, you haven't started to take it seriously yet. Seriously, getting serious as an author is just getting to 10,000 hours, because at 10,000 hours, you can write something decent. The first 10,000 hours, you maybe get lucky and write some stuff and editors help it out. And hopefully that works out for you. But 10,000 hours is just the start. Then at 20 and 30,000 hours is when you start to actually achieve mastery and, have the opportunity to produce the legendary works. So if we're going to start, and this is what I recommend, is kind of building upon the style, building a world, building something that you're going to be remembered for, because it's not just good for book sales and creating a legacy, but I think it's just easier to write. And then you can really start to observe outside in reality what's happening. I've personally chosen, because I've lived in the desert my entire life, to write about the desert. There are times when I write about other places and other things, but most of the time I write about the desert. And when people make associations about my writing, that's something they always think about, because it's always there. But what if you start to build a style? So I know a guy, and I knew him in high school, and he's a great musician, but he's into he's into screamo bands. And he's dedicated his life to music. He still lives in an apartment, but him and his band and, its circulating members have been, pursuing this screamo rock vision forever. And they've had moderate success. They've toured around and they make enough money so they don't have to work jobs, but they've never hit stardom. But what's interesting is that, from what I could tell, and I'm not the biggest screamo fan, but I've asked people who are, my wife is more, or was really into that stuff back when she was younger. I'm like, is this style kind of appealing to you? And she's like, no, but it's really good, but no, it's just, there's something off with it. And that's what's interesting about style, that if you search within your own heart and find what you're really meant to do or feel called to do, what if it just isn't right for the time? And this is some of the most heartbreaking stuff ever, that you may go on this journey and most people don't make it. I've known plenty of authors who have put the work in and maybe have gone full time, but they've never really, from what I've been able to tell, gotten the reward for the amount of work they've put in. And it's just because their style isn't matching with the cultural current of the time. And so that's something that you're going to have to accept right now. Because if you want to be a legend, if you want to do your best work, you're going to have to focus on your own style. Because as you start to master writing, as you start to get to 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 hours, you can pivot. You can go write something that's more sellable or marketable. But it's not going to be the best you're able to do. Maybe it's going, and if you need to do a cash grab, I'm not judging you for that. But I want you guys to commit to your style, to something that you're trying to build over the course of decades, no matter how the public perceives it. And like I said, it is heartbreaking. But that's the only way you can truly build a legacy, even if it's just for a small group of people, because in the long run, we're all forgotten. We talk about McCarthy and Shakespeare and these people, but over the course of time, we might forget more and more of them. Like in one of my favorite books Dune, that's 10,000 years in the future, they talk about the Bible or Hitler or some of these people like they're nothing. And eventually, all of us and all the great authors will be nothing, and they will be replaced by something that has an immediacy bias. Or excuse me, it is because of an immediacy bias. So the second way to be original, according to Murakami, is, quote, that style must have the power to update itself. It should grow with time, never resting in the same place for long, since it expresses an internal and spontaneous process of self-reinvention. And obviously, in my opinion, the best example of this is the Beatles. And, you're listening to them, I want to hold your hand. And suddenly they start smoking weed and take acid, and suddenly it's Revolver and Rubber Soul and the Magical Mystery Tour. And like they just, and their style evolves and it starts growing upon itself. But when you look at like the White Album or Let It Be, they continue to grow. They kind of transcended that like purely psychedelic style for songs like Helter Skelter, which could be considered the first metal song of all time. And there are songs like Blackbird that are a huge evolution from kind of, some of the earlier stuff they were doing, love songs and stuff. And then when you get to Abbey Road, you have a song like I Want You, She's So Heavy, that's out of this world. That's just another total quantum leap. I think the same could be said about Murakami when I'm looking. Obviously, after Pinball 1973, he makes a jump to a Wild Sheep Chase and really puts together a decent magical realism novel. And that continues on into Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. But then he pivots styles again and releases Norwegian Wood, which is like a love story and something totally different for him. And then he pivots again and he moves back into the magical realism realm with like Dance, 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 which has a lot of really good elements in it. If I think a couple things were different, Dance, Dance, Dance would be Murakami's greatest novel. But he was working some things out that eventually helped him write The Windenburg Chronicle, which a lot considered his best novel. Then over the next 7 years, he reinvents himself again for Kafka on the Shore. And he does that through Sputnik Sweetheart, which does have that kind of like detached feel. And then once again, he does that with 7 years later with IQ-84, with After Dark in the middle. And you could see that After Dark was starting to play with that kind of liminal space stuff. He's starting to reinvent himself, and it works beautifully. And what's great about writing is that you can continue. Cormac McCarthy released The Passenger at 89 years old. You have decades to improve and to keep reinventing yourself. Music most of the time is a young man's game. When I hear what Paul McCartney or Roger Waters or whoever is releasing in 2024, I'm a little bit suspicious. It's not that good. Like there isn't an evolution. It's so great. Like great, good for them. Glad they're doing it. But there's some kind of spunk and spontaneity and something with music that it's really more of a young man's game. But writing and philosophy and these things do slow down a little bit, but you still can achieve kind of these massive things into your 70s and 80s, which is really good news for us. And the way, and my number one recommendation for you to do this is to publish, to get something done. When we see Murakami, he is publishing, like a lot of the time, these middle books are what eventually lead to some of these big jumps. But if you're standing still, if you're not publishing, even if it's going into the Kindle graveyard or whatever, there's something to be said about publishing massive, something that is real, a final product. And if you're not into books, or if you're into short stories or something that necessarily doesn't lend itself to books as well, then just be publishing consistently on Substack and, building an audience and just getting eyes on your stuff, even if it's just a few, will create a massive reinvention, because there is a magic, as I talk about all the time, to people looking at your stuff. I know you've experienced this, and if you haven't, then you just aren't sharing it enough. When you post or give someone your work, as soon as you give it to them, you're like, oh my God, I need to change something. That was wrong. And like, if you've ever been in a workshop and you send it off to everyone or you give it to someone, you start to think like, should I change that? Should I have done that? And when another consciousness starts to read what you were doing, something happens magically in the universe. I don't know what it is. This just happened to me this morning. I publish poetry daily on Substack. And after I sent out the poem today, someone commented and was like, yeah, great poem, Ian. And then I re-looked back at the poem, something that I spent a good amount of time on this morning. And I was like, oh my God, like this part totally sucks. Like I repeat myself kind of, and the flow's off. Like and I instantly knew what to do. And so reinvention requires, I think, a reciprocal relationship with an audience, even if it's small. It doesn't need to be some grand audience like Murakami or whoever has. Okay, moving on to step number 3. And I am starting a free writing community, everybody, with courses and a community unlike anything else any booktuber has ever done. This is better than any Discord or website because it is free. It's going to be moderated well, and it's hopefully going to provide a ton of value without all the bullshit self-promotion and problems that places like Reddit and other, things have. And on there, I'm going to have, when it launches, so you can hop on the waiting list right now, I'm going to have 5 different courses that'll be building up slowly. One on how to build your audience as a writer, so you have readers, a prose writing course, a poetry writing course, a productivity course, how to write more, like I publish every single day, and then a meditation for authors course for those who want to get more into meditation and apply it to their writing, which is really a big part of, writing a lot, in my opinion. So the link to that is down in the description below. It is free. It will be launching soon. So if you want to hop on the wait list, as soon as I launch it, you will get an email. And I would honestly love to see you over there. Because speaking of projects, that's how I view this channel. I'm trying to do something original. No other booktuber is running a free community like that will have thousands of people on it who are all focused on releasing conscious writing. Most people don't, share all the secrets. I don't care if you guys, the more the merrier. That's something else Murakami believes. If I'm helping you grow your audience and become a great writer, then there's just going to be more room for me later on because you're helping, bring more readers in. And so that's kind of one of the negative aspects of a lot of writing channels and weird people is that, first of all, sometimes they're super genre fiction, which is fine, or they kind of a lot of writers just hold back their secrets because they're superstitious. Okay, moving on to the third point Murakami makes on originality. Quote, over time, that characteristic style should become integrated within the psyche of its audience to become a part of their basic standard of evaluation. Subsequent generations of artists should see that style as a rich resource from which they can draw. And so, as I was just talking about, there is a reciprocity that eventually needs to happen. And sometimes in subsequent generations, it takes a while for people to recognize the greatness of somebody. Like, for instance, it just came in my head right now, Friedrich Nietzsche, his philosophy was manipulated and stuff, and people thought, like, this is what inspired the Nazis, even though it did. But they really didn't understand a lot of his work until the 1950s and 60s, where a lot of it was retranslated, and people kind of updated a lot of it and started to work with it. But Murakami makes a great point that it becomes a basic standard of evaluation. Whenever I read a magical realism novel, Murakami is who I'm comparing it to. Whenever I read a book that takes place in Japan, even if it's in a totally different style, even if it's like Yukio Mishima writing The Sea of Fertility tetralogy, where it's like Japan meets Proust with like weird characters, I'm still comparing it to Murakami. And more important than that, it needs to be a rich resource from which us writers can draw, because there are some more esoteric styles where you look at and you're like, what can I do with this? Someone who I think of kind of like this is Margaret Atwood. I love Margaret Atwood. Written a lot of great books, dystopian or just normal kind of typical literary fiction books, all types of stuff. But I never think about her when writing. I never think like, damn, she is the person I'm going to think back to for dystopian novels, even though her whole Year of the Flood, Orcs and Crake series is amazing. That's not really who I think to. I might go back to another female author who I really love, Octavia Butler, for dystopian stuff. And so if you want to be someone that inspires others and is a thought leader in the future, you have to do two different things. You have to kind of be more of like an autistic savant, like an Immanuel Kant who just stays in your room all the time, or a Kafka or someone of that nature, which I know a lot of us want to be. Like, that's how we feel, and like that's every writer's vision. You send in the manuscript and it gets published. You don't have to do any promotion. You don't have to do anything. Everything's fine. Like, okay, great. Like, that's what we want. But most likely, you're going to have to be someone who's interacting with their audience. This is something that's actually blown my mind recently, just like in regards to YouTube and like public speaking. I've started to realize, just because I'm running a Substack where I have daily office hours where I talk to my audience every single day, like no matter what, I've learned more than I'm like, oh my God, I'm talking to a totally different person than I thought I was. Like, for some crazy reason, I thought that I was talking to some like 24-year-old who is like a partial genius and he's trying to get to the next level and be a writer, and he's not doing anything else. He's living in an apartment and he's giving up he's burned the boats. But in reality, a lot of my listeners are really smart, mostly middle-aged, 20 males from 25 to 40 who are working normal jobs, most of the time have girlfriends, are reasonable people, and are really smart and know they have potential as a writer. They've maybe released a couple things already, but are really trying to take it to the next level, but aren't necessarily like a martyr or like trying to, they're not ready to give it all up for writing. And they're kind, and they're actually like really sociable. Like, I've talked now to hundreds of people individually, just, me and them on my Substack. almost none of them have been weird. You would think that with the stigma of writers and a bunch of men who just sit around and write all day and want to read, that I would find these weird groups of people. No. People who play the video game crowd is 1,000 times weirder. The crypto group and all the conservatives and like the communists, like they have worse problems. They're less sociable. And so that's helped me realize, and it's like, I don't care. I'm not sitting here. And as a writer, like we think it's a shameful thing to change your style. Like, damn, I'm going to listen to the audience and change my style. Let's do the writing janitor voice. I'm going to change. Oh, I can't change my style. This is mine. But it's not like you're changing your entire thing. But once you realize who's reading it, you're like, why wouldn't I make this the best possible thing for them? Cormac McCarthy didn't need to write about women because over 95%, if not more, of McCarthy's readers are men. And that's fine. He didn't need to sit and walk it back like political correctness, like the Disney Channel, and write about women and add all these random characters into his work. No, because he was writing for someone and he was trying to serve them the best way he could. He was at some level serving himself and like his vision and what he thought was important and idealistic things. And the same with Murakami. People talk about it all the time. He's misogynistic and he portrays female characters weird and objectifies them, and there's weird underage sex. And he just keeps doing it because he understands, especially, that people's unconscious is weird, that it doesn't need to be rational. It doesn't need to be perfect, that there are creeps and pervs and weird things out in the world. And just because you write about it doesn't that mean that's who you are. And that's just a part of life. And what if, with all the pushback, Murakami changed? We would hate him. And a lot of writers I've seen falling off, like Don DeLillo or others, I feel like someone just needs to sit them down and have a conversation with them and be like, yo, what happened, man? Like, have people been blowing smoke up your ass for so long that you think you can just, divert from your old style and like do weird stuff and think it's going to be successful? And I'm saying that artists should stay contained forever, but they should continue to build and transform off of what they've already had. Because if you just go back to ground zero, then that's just something you should be working on the side, or you just have to be really good. Like Cormac McCarthy wrote a dystopian novel out of nowhere, and it took him 6 weeks to write, aka The Road, and it's great. Murakami wrote a love novel, and it was great. And so what are you guys going to do now? Now that you've heard this, what's your plan? I mean, the proper preparation prevents poor performance. And if you want to brand yourself, if you want to be known, then you're going to have to go in a certain direction. What are your plans for that? What are you thinking? Let me know. Go tell me in the writing group. I'm sure there'll be discussion posts on that. By the time you see this, unless it's in the next 4 days from when it's posted, it will be up. I would love to see you over there. I would love to see you guys in my other Murakami videos. I put the playlist down below. And I hope that you have a great and productive day as a beautiful writer.